Margaret Chen had mastered the art of being invisible. She moved through Denver International Airport like water through sand, present but unremarkable, there but easily forgotten. At 58, she perfected every detail of her camouflage. The faded University of Colorado sweatshirt, soft from 2 decades of washing, comfortable walking shoes with worn heels, reading glasses on a beaded chain her sister had given her 10 Christmases ago. Her shoulder-length hair, more gray than black now, pulled back in a practical ponytail. A canvas tote bag stuffed with student essays she'd probably grade on the plane. To every person who glanced her way, and few did, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a middle-aged woman, probably a teacher or librarian heading home after visiting family. Forgettable, safe, ordinary. That's exactly what she wanted. Gate B37 bustled with the usual chaos of a Friday morning departure. Business travelers hunched over laptops, thumbs flying across keyboards in a race against boarding time. A young family wrangled 3 children under 5, goldfish crackers scattered across the floor like confetti. College students slumped in seats, AirPods in, oblivious to everything. Nobody looked at Maggie as she found a seat near the window, pulled out her dog-eared mystery novel, and disappeared into the background noise of contemporary American life. United Flight 447 to Seattle. Departure, 9:47 a.m. Arrival, 11:23 a.m. A routine flight she'd taken dozens of times, commuting between her small house in Bellingham, Washington, and her brother's family in Denver, the ultimate in unremarkable travel. Boarding began with the usual hierarchy: first class, then families, then everyone else in their designated groups. Maggie waited patiently in Group 4, watching a businessman in front of her argue with the gate agent about his carry-on size. She smiled slightly. Some battles weren't worth fighting. When she finally stepped onto the Boeing 737, the familiar smell of recycled air and cleaning solution greeted her. She navigated the narrow aisle to seat 12C, middle seat, her least favorite, but she'd booked late. The window seat held a businessman already asleep, mouth slightly open, wedding ring catching the light. The aisle seat remained empty for now. Maggie settled in, tucking her tote bag under the seat in front of her. She'd learned to make herself small to take up minimal space to avoid the awkward elbow wars that plagued middle-seat passengers. Her mystery novel, a formulaic thriller she'd read twice before, opened to page 47. Comfort reading. Predictable. Nothing that required real attention. A young woman in yoga pants and a Stanford hoodie claimed the aisle seat, barely glancing at Maggie before plugging in her earbuds and opening her laptop. Good. No forced small talk about weather or travel plans. Maggie appreciated the modern norm of mutual isolation. As the plane filled, Maggie watched the familiar pre-flight ritual. Overhead bins slammed. Flight attendants demonstrated safety procedures nobody watched. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with welcomes and weather reports and the expected arrival time in Seattle. What none of them knew, what nobody in this sealed aluminum tube hurtling toward the sky could possibly know, was that the unremarkable woman in seat 12C had once controlled aircraft that broke sound barriers and defied physics. 23 years ago, Captain Margaret Maggie Chen had been one of only 3 women selected for the Air Force's elite test pilot program at Edwards Air Force Base. While her fellow passengers in 1998 had been watching Titanic in theaters and worrying about Y2K, Maggie had been flying experimental aircraft at speeds most people couldn't comprehend, testing prototypes that pushed the absolute limits of human engineering. She'd flown the X-31 Enhanced Fighter Maneuverability aircraft through post-stall gyrations that would make a normal pilot black out. She'd tested thrust vectoring systems on jets that existed only in classified documents. She'd taken aircraft designed by the best minds in aerospace engineering and found their breaking points, sometimes literally. 3 emergency ejections. 4 aircraft lost. 17 successful test missions that redefined what was possible. Her call sign had been ice, not because she was cold but because nothing rattled her. Engine failure at Mach 2. Ice stayed calm. Complete hydraulic loss over the Pacific. Ice found a solution. The day she'd landed an X-plane with no computer control, using only manual controls and pure stick-and-rudder skill, had become legend in test pilot circles. But that was another lifetime. The crash in 1998 had ended everything. A routine test flight that went catastrophically wrong. 3 compressed vertebrae. 6 months of physical therapy. Her medical certificate permanently revoked. At 35, her flying career was over. She'd grieved quietly, then moved on. Finished her physics degree. Got her teaching certificate. Found a job at Bellingham High School, where teenagers called her Ms. Chen, and complained about homework and never imagined their soft-spoken teacher had once commanded million-dollar aircraft. 20 years of teaching. 20 years of grading papers and explaining Newton's laws and chaperoning prom and living a quiet, normal, unremarkable life. She'd made peace with it. More than peace, she'd found purpose. Her students needed her. The thrill of flying had been replaced by the satisfaction of watching a struggling student finally understand projectile motion. She'd stopped thinking of herself as a pilot. That woman was gone. The plane pushed back from the gate, and Maggie absently fastened her seatbelt, her hands performing the motion without thought. The engine spooled up with that distinctive whine. They taxied toward the runway, and through the window, Maggie watched Denver's November gray sky waiting above. Flight 447 took its position. The engines roared. The acceleration pressed Maggie back into her seat, a sensation her body remembered from thousands of takeoffs in dozens of aircraft. They lifted off smoothly, climbing into the overcast morning. Just another flight, just another Friday, just another invisible woman heading home. Maggie opened her book and began to read, having no idea that in 37 minutes everything would change, that the past she'd buried would come roaring back, that the woman she used to be would be needed one more time. For now, though, she was simply Margaret Chen, high school physics teacher, sitting in seat 12C, reading a mystery novel, completely and perfectly invisible. The coffee was mediocre, but Maggie accepted it gratefully when the flight attendant's cart reached row 12. Black, no sugar. She'd just taken her second sip, her mystery novel propped against the tray table, when the world came apart. The sound came first, not the Hollywood explosion she'd heard in disaster movies, but something far more sinister. A muffled thump deep in the belly of the aircraft, like a giant fist punching metal. The kind of sound that makes every molecule in your body scream wrong. Maggie's coffee erupted from her cup, splashing across her book, her sweatshirt, the tray table. The plane shuddered violently, a full-body convulsion that rattled overhead bins and sent a flight attendant stumbling into an armrest. Then the screaming started. It began with the young mother 3 rows up, whose toddler had been ripped from her arms by the violent shaking. It spread like wildfire, gasps, shrieks, a man's deep voice shouting, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The businessman beside Maggie jerked awake, eyes wild with confusion and terror. Yellow oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling in perfect unison, dangling like grotesque party streamers. The cabin erupted into chaos. "Put on your masks," a flight attendant shouted, her professional composure cracking. "Pull down and place over your nose and mouth." But Maggie wasn't reaching for her mask. Not yet. Her eyes were locked on the window, her pilot's brain automatically assessing, calculating, analyzing. The left wing was wrong, completely wrong. Where the engine should have been creating a smooth contrail of exhaust, there was smoke, dark and angry, streaming back along the fuselage. The engine cowling showed visible damage, metal peeled back like a tin can. As she watched, the wing dipped at an angle that made her stomach clench. Contained engine failure, her mind cataloged automatically. Loss of thrust on engine 1. Asymmetric power. They're going to yaw left if they don't compensate. The plane tilted hard. Passengers screamed louder as the left side dropped, the horizon through the windows going vertical. Bags flew from overhead compartments. A laptop sailed down the aisle. The young woman next to Maggie grabbed the armrest so hard her knuckles went white. "We're going to die," someone sobbed. "We're all going to die." Maggie's training kicked in like a switch being flipped. Her breathing stayed even. Her hands gripped the armrests, but not in panic, in assessment. She could feel it through the seat, through the subtle vibrations. The pilots fighting for control, overcorrecting, the aircraft system struggling to maintain stability. 37,000 feet, she calculated, remembering the captain's earlier announcement. Over Idaho, nearest airport, Boise, maybe 60 miles. The plane shuddered again, a sickening drop that left her stomach floating. More screams. A man vomited into the seat pocket in front of him. The smell of fear, sweat and bile and terror filled the cabin. Through the chaos, Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom. He was trying to sound calm, but Maggie heard the tension underneath, tight as a wire about to snap. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced a mechanical issue. Flight attendants, emergency positions. Everyone remain seated with seatbelts fastened." Mechanical issue, the understatement of the century. Maggie watched the altimeter in her mind, feeling the descent. They were dropping, not in a controlled glide but in something more desperate. The engines, or engine, singular now, whined at a pitch that set her teeth on edge. She recognized that sound. An engine being pushed beyond its design parameters, trying to compensate for its missing twin. A flight attendant stumbled past, grabbing seat backs for balance. Marcus Chen, according to his name tag, no relation probably. His face was pale, professional mask slipping. "We're trained for this," he was saying, more to himself than the passengers. "We're trained for this." But Maggie could see in his eyes that this was beyond training. This was the scenario instructors use to teach worst-case planning, the one they never actually expect. The plane rolled again, and this time Maggie felt it in her bones. The pilots were losing hydraulic pressure. The controls were getting mushy, unresponsive. She'd felt it before, in a prototype over the Mojave Desert in 1995. That sick, floating feeling when the aircraft stops listening to inputs, when metal and physics take over from human intention. They're fighting her, Maggie thought. They need to stop fighting and start dancing. Around her, chaos multiplied. A teenage boy was hyperventilating into a paper bag. An elderly woman prayed loudly in Spanish. The businessman beside Maggie was on his phone, shouting, "I love you," to someone who probably couldn't hear him over the screaming. The Stanford student in the aisle seat was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, fingers flying across her phone keyboard in what were probably final text messages to family. Maggie reached over and gently touched her arm. "Put your oxygen mask on," she said quietly. "Then help me with mine." The young woman looked at her with eyes glazed with terror, but she nodded, hands shaking as she pulled the mask down. Another violent shudder. The plane dropped what felt like 1,000 feet in seconds. Maggie's stomach lurched. Through the window, she could see the ground now, mountains, forests, the wild Idaho landscape that would kill them all if they hit it at this speed. They have maybe 10 minutes, she calculated, less if they can't stabilize. Flight attendant Marcus appeared in the aisle again, this time moving with desperate purpose. His eyes scanned the cabin, looking for something, someone. He grabbed the PA handset, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Does anyone on this aircraft have flight experience? Anyone at all?" Silent, even the screaming seemed to pause. "Please," his voice broke. "We need anyone with aviation experience, anyone who's ever flown a plane." Maggie felt every passenger around her shrink into their seats. The businessman shook his head frantically. The Stanford student stared straight ahead, paralyzed. No one moved. No one spoke. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. Her mouth went dry. 20 years, a voice whispered in her head. You haven't flown in 20 years. You can't. You're back, your medical certificate. You're not that person anymore. The plane bucked again, harder this time. A child's scream cut through the cabin like a knife. Through the window, the mountains were getting closer. Marcus's eyes swept the cabin again, desperate, pleading. Please, is there anyone? Maggie Chen, high school physics teacher, invisible woman in seat 12C, felt something ancient and powerful wake up inside her chest. Her hands were steady on the armrests. Her breathing was even. Her mind was clear. She'd spent 20 years being nobody. But 157 people were about to die. Slowly, deliberately, Margaret Chen raised her hand. Every head in rows 11 through 13 turned to stare at the middle-aged woman in the faded sweatshirt, hand raised like a student asking to use the bathroom. Flight attendant Marcus Chen rushed down the aisle, hope and desperation fighting for control of his face. He reached Maggie's row, breathing hard, and looked down at her with an expression that shifted rapidly from relief to confusion to something dangerously close to dismissal. Ma'am, he said, his voice tight, I need someone with actual flight experience, commercial or military aviation, someone who. I'm a former Air Force test pilot, Maggie interrupted, her voice quiet but carrying an edge of steel that made Marcus stop mid-sentence. 15 years, Edwards Air Force Base, Experimental Aircraft Division. The words felt foreign in her mouth, like speaking a language she'd forgotten. She hadn't said them out loud in 2 decades, but they were true. They had always been true. Marcus blinked. You're a pilot. Was, Maggie corrected, already unbuckling her seatbelt. But I've flown aircraft in worse situations than this. Get me to the cockpit, now. The businessman beside her actually laughed, a high, hysterical sound. Her, you're trusting her, she's a grandma. Maggie turned to look at him, and something in her eyes made him shrink back into his seat. It was the look she'd given cocky young pilots who'd questioned her at Edwards. The look that said she'd forgotten more about flying than they'd ever learn. I'm 58, not dead, she said evenly. And I've landed planes you've never heard of in conditions that would make you weep. So sit down, shut up, and let me do my job. The cabin had gone quiet except for the tortured whine of the struggling engine and the whispered prayers of terrified passengers. Everyone was watching now. This couldn't be real. This ordinary woman, with her reading glasses and mom jeans and gray hair, couldn't be what stood between them and death. Could she? Marcus was staring at her with new eyes, seeing past the camouflage for the first time. Can you show me identification? Credentials? The plane lurched violently to the left and a fresh wave of screams erupted. Somewhere up front, overhead bins popped open, spilling luggage into the aisle. They were running out of time. My credentials are that I know exactly what's happening to this aircraft right now, Maggie said, standing up despite the turbulence, gripping the seat back for balance. You've lost your left engine. Complete failure, probably turbine disintegration. The asymmetric thrust is causing uncommanded yaw. Your pilots are compensating with rudder, but I can hear from the engine pitch that they're overcorrecting, which means they're probably losing hydraulic pressure in the primary system. Marcus's eyes widened. Your backup generator should have kicked in when the engine failed, but I'm guessing it didn't, which means you're running on battery power and whatever hydraulics you have left. You're at, she closed her eyes, feeling the angle of descent through her feet, approximately 35,000 feet now, dropping at maybe 3,000 feet per minute, and you have maybe 8-9 minutes before the pilots have to make critical decisions about where and how to put this plane down. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Marcus. So you can stand here and check my ID, or you can get me to that cockpit and maybe we all live through this. Your choice. Make it fast. For a long moment, Marcus just stared at her, Then his training kicked in. Follow me. Maggie stepped into the aisle, her legs steady despite the violent shaking of the aircraft. The Stanford student grabbed her hand as she passed. Please, the young woman whispered. Please save us. Working on it, Maggie said, squeezing her hand once before letting go. The walk to the front of the cabin felt like miles. Passengers watched her pass with expressions ranging from hope to disbelief to naked terror. She heard whispers. That's who they're sending up. She doesn't even look like a pilot. We're all going to die. Maggie blocked them out. She'd heard worse in her career. The old boys club at Edwards hadn't exactly welcomed her with open arms in 1983. She'd learned to let doubt slide off her like rain off wings. Another violent shudder. The plane dropped suddenly, and Maggie stumbled, catching herself on a seat back. A man grabbed her arm to steady her. Are you really a pilot? He asked, his face gray with fear. Maggie looked at him, really looked at him. He was maybe 30, wedding ring on his finger, phone clutched in his other hand with a photo of 2 small children on the screen. I really am, she said, and I'm very, very good at what I do. It wasn't bragging, it was fact. And right now, these people needed facts more than false modesty. Marcus was clearing a path through the chaos of the first-class cabin. A woman was being sick into an air sickness bag. A man had his arms wrapped around his wife, both of them crying. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with iron-gray hair, stood braced in the galley, her professional composure barely intact. Marcus, what are you? She started. She's a pilot, Jennifer, Air Force test pilot. Jennifer looked at Maggie with the same skepticism Marcus had shown, but there wasn't time to argue. The cockpit door was right there, locked per post 9/11 protocols. They need to know you're coming, Jennifer said, reaching for the intercom. Tell them a former test pilot is coming in, Maggie said. Tell them I've flown aircraft with complete system failures at Mach 2 and lived to talk about it. Tell them I can help. Jennifer's finger hovered over the button. What's your name? Captain Margaret Chen, call sign ICE. The old designation came out automatically, a ghost from the past, but they can call me Maggie. Jennifer pressed the intercom and spoke rapidly to the cockpit. There was a pause, a muffled response. Then the lock clicked. The cockpit door swung open. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. It had been 20 years since she'd seen a cockpit from this angle, standing at the threshold, about to take responsibility for lives that weren't her own. The familiar layout of instruments, the cramped space, the tension so thick you could cut it. Captain James Rodriguez didn't even turn around. Lady, we don't have time for passengers. Get her out of here. Captain, Maggie said, her voice cutting through the chaos of alarms and warnings like a blade. Primary hydraulics failed. Backup generator offline. You're getting asymmetric thrust from engine 2 and you're compensating wrong on the rudder. You're making it worse. Rodriguez's head snapped around. His face was covered in sweat, eyes bloodshot from stress and concentration. First Officer Sarah Park looked equally desperate, both hands on the yoke, fighting the aircraft's death spiral. Who the hell are you? Rodriguez demanded. Maggie stepped into the cockpit, her eyes already scanning the instrument panel, reading the story of the aircraft's failure in the dancing needles and flashing warnings. 20 years fell away like shed skin. She was ice again. She was born for this. I'm the person who's going to help you land this plane, she said, strapping into the jump seat with practiced efficiency. Now stop fighting her and listen to me. We don't have much time. The altimeter read 32,000 feet and dropping. The mountains below were getting closer. And Margaret Chen was finally, after 20 years of hiding, exactly where she belonged. The cockpit of United Flight 447 was a symphony of chaos. Warning alarms screamed in overlapping frequencies. The master caution, the terrain warning, the hydraulic pressure alert all fighting for attention. Red lights blinked across the instrument panel like angry eyes. The aircraft bucked and shuddered beneath them, a living thing in its death throes. Captain James Rodriguez looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his collar. His hands gripped the yoke so hard his knuckles had gone white. Beside him, First Officer Sarah Park was equally desperate, her voice hoarse from shouting communications to air traffic control. Boise Tower, United 447, we are declaring an emergency. Total engine failure on Engine 1, losing hydraulics, need immediate priority landing any available runway. The reply crackled back. United 447, you are cleared for emergency approach runway 10 right. Emergency equipment is standing by. Advise souls on board. 157 souls, Park said, her voice breaking slightly on the last word. Maggie heard it all from the jump seat, but her eyes were locked on the instruments. Her brain was processing information at a speed she'd forgotten she was capable of, 20 years of rust burning away in seconds as muscle memory and training took over. The primary flight display showed their descent rate, 3,200 feet per minute. Too fast. The artificial horizon showed a severe left bank. The engine instruments told the story of Engine 1's catastrophic failure, 0 RPM, 0 thrust, just a dead weight hanging off the left wing. Engine 2 was screaming, pushed to 98% power, trying to do the work of 2 engines and failing. Captain Rodriguez, Maggie said, her voice cutting through the noise with calm authority. You need to reduce power on Engine 2 immediately. Rodriguez didn't even look at her. Are you insane? We're already falling like a rock. You're falling because of Engine 2, Maggie said. You're creating too much asymmetric thrust. The aircraft is fighting you. Reduce to 70%, now. Lady, I don't know who you are, but I'm not taking flying advice from a passenger. The plane lurched violently, dropping another 1,000 feet in seconds. Park screamed. The yoke shook in Rodriguez's hands. Do it, Maggie shouted, her command voice. The one she'd used to control test flights, the one that had made colonels snap to attention, filling the tiny cockpit. Reduce power now or we're going to enter an unrecoverable spin. Rodriguez's hand moved to the throttle, hesitated. His eyes met Maggie's in the reflection of the windscreen. What he saw there made his decision. He pulled the throttle back. The screaming whine of Engine 2 decreased. For a heart-stopping moment the plane seemed to drop faster. Park gasped. Rodriguez's face went gray. Then the aircraft leveled. Not perfectly, but the violent yawing stopped. The shuddering decreased. The artificial horizon began to stabilize. Oh my God, Park whispered. Rodriguez stared at his instruments like they'd performed a miracle. How did you? Because I've flown prototypes that lost engines at Mach 2, Maggie said, already scanning for the next problem. You don't fight asymmetric thrust. You work with it. Now hydraulics. What do you have left? Park checked her panel, hands still shaking. System A is gone. System B is at 40% and dropping. System C shows partial pressure, but it's intermittent. Backup generator. Failed to deploy when Engine 1 went. We're on battery power. Maggie closed her eyes, visualizing the 737's hydraulic system in her mind. She'd studied commercial aircraft designs as part of her transition training at Edwards, understanding how military innovations trickled down to civilian applications. The 737 was old technology compared to what she'd flown, but the principles were the same. There's a manual hydraulic override, she said. Panel C7 above your head, Captain. It's an auxiliary pump. Backup to the backup. Rodriguez looked up at the ceiling panel, scanning the labels. I don't see. Behind the protective cover, left side, red and yellow striped handle. How do you know this? Park asked, staring at Maggie like she was a ghost. I flew the prototype this design was based on, 1994, NASA test series at Edwards. Maggie leaned forward, pointing. That handle. Pull it down and hold for 10 seconds, then lock it in place. Rodriguez found it, popped the protective cover, and pulled. A different mechanical sound joined the cacophony, the whine of a manual pump engaging. The hydraulic pressure gauge for System C twitched, then began to climb. It's working, Park said, disbelief in her voice. Hydraulic pressure increasing. We're getting control response back. The yoke in Rodriguez's hands became more responsive. He tested it gently and the wings responded. Not perfect, they'd lost too much for that, but functional. Okay, Rodriguez said, and for the first time since Maggie had entered the cockpit, his voice carried something other than panic. Okay, we have partial control, but how do we land this thing? We've lost spoilers, thrust reversers, and half our hydraulics. We're coming in heavy and fast with limited control authority. Differential thrust landing, Maggie said immediately. Use engine 2 like a rudder. You'll steer as much with the throttle as with the yoke. That's not standard procedure. Standard procedure is for aircraft with working engines on both wings, Maggie interrupted. This is special circumstances procedure. I've done it before. In what? A fighter jet? In an X-31 experimental aircraft over the Pacific Ocean with no computer control, no hydraulics, and a stuck throttle, Maggie said flatly. And I walked away from it. Trust me, Captain, this is doable. Rodriguez looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. This gray-haired woman in a coffee-stained sweatshirt, strapped into his jump seat, speaking with the confidence of someone who'd been to hell and back. Who are you? He asked quietly. Right now, I'm your best chance of getting everyone home alive, Maggie said. She pointed at the windscreen where the Idaho landscape was rushing up to meet them. We're at 28,000 feet. Boise is 42 miles northeast. We need to set up our approach now. I'll talk you through it, but you have to trust me. Park was staring at her instruments. United 447 Boise approach. You're cleared direct Boise VOR, vectors for runway 10 right. Current weather, winds 270 at 15, gusting 22. Crosswind, Rodriguez muttered. Perfect, just perfect. Maggie felt a smile tug at her lips, the first smile in this nightmare. Captain, I once landed an aircraft in a desert sandstorm with zero visibility and no instruments. A crosswind is a gift. She leaned forward, placing her hand on the back of his seat. Now listen carefully. We're going to set up a long, shallow approach. No steep turns. This aircraft can't handle them. We'll use differential thrust for directional control. Your first officer will handle communications and monitoring. You'll fly the yoke. I'll call out the power settings. This is insane, Rodriguez said, but he was already adjusting course. This is Tuesday for me, Maggie said, or it was once upon a time. The altimeter spun down, 24,000 feet, 22,000, 20,000. Outside the windscreen, Boise came into view, a cluster of civilization in the wilderness. Somewhere down there, emergency vehicles were racing into position. Foam trucks, ambulances, fire crews, all waiting to see if United 447 would land or crash. Okay, Rodriguez said, his jaw set with determination. Tell me what to do. And Margaret Chen, who had been nobody for 20 years, who had graded papers and explained physics and lived the quietest of lives, became ice again. First, she said, her voice steady as stone, reduce descent rate to 2,000 feet per minute. Gentle pressure on the yoke, don't force it. Rodriguez complied. The plane responded sluggishly but responded. Good, now engine power to 65%. Hold it steady. The engine note changed. We're going to come in hot and high, Maggie continued. It's going to feel wrong. Your instincts will tell you to slow down, drop faster. Ignore them. Trust your instruments. Trust me. Park looked back at her. Can we really do this? Maggie met her eyes. She thought of the X-planes she'd flown, the emergencies she'd survived, the aircraft she'd landed that everyone said were unflyable. She thought of her students back in Bellingham who deserved their teacher to come home. She thought of the 157 people in the cabin behind her, trusting their lives to 3 people they'd never met. "Yes," Maggie said, "we can do this. We're going to do this." The mountains fell away beneath them. Boise International Airport sprawled ahead. And Flight 447 began its final approach, 15,000 feet. Boise International Airport spread below them like a child's toy model, tiny buildings, miniature vehicles, ribbons of runway that looked impossibly narrow from this altitude. Emergency vehicles lined the taxiways, red and white lights flashing in silent urgency. United 447 Boise Tower. You are 12 miles from runway 10 right. Winds now 280 at 18, gusting 24. Emergency equipment in position. Field is yours. Land any runway, any direction. First Officer Sarah Park acknowledged with a voice that had steadied into professional calm, the kind that comes when you've accepted you might die and decided to be excellent anyway. Boise Tower, United 447. We have the field in sight. Commencing approach. Captain James Rodriguez's hands trembled on the yoke. 12 miles. We're at 15,000 feet. That's a 4,000 foot per mile descent. We'll overshoot. No, Maggie said from the jump seat, her eyes locked on the instruments. We're going to bleed altitude in a wide spiral. Can't do steep turns with damaged hydraulics, so we'll use distance and time. Start a gentle left turn. Very gentle. 2 degrees bank, no more. 2 degrees won't get us around in time. Captain, Maggie's voice cut like ice. I have landed planes in worse condition than this. Trust me or don't, but decide now. We're out of time for debate. Rodriguez's jaw clenched, then he nodded. 2-degree bank. The aircraft began its lazy turn, a wide, sweeping arc that would spiral them down toward the runway. It felt wrong. Every instinct screamed they were going too wide, too slow, that they'd overshoot and have to go around. But going around wasn't an option. They'd get one chance. Just one. Engine power to 60%, Maggie commanded. Use short bursts on the throttle to control the turn. Pulse it. Don't hold steady pressure. Rodriguez's right hand moved to the throttle of Engine 2, their only engine. He pushed forward slightly. The aircraft yawed right, pulled back, straightened. That's it, Maggie said. You're flying with the throttle now. The yoke is just for fine adjustments. Think of Engine 2 as your rudder. 12,000 feet. The ground was getting closer, details emerging. She could see cars on the highway, the shadow of their crippled aircraft sliding across the landscape below like a wounded bird. Gear down, Maggie said. Park's hand moved to the landing gear lever, hesitated. With limited hydraulics. They'll freefall into position. Gravity is our friend, do it. Park pulled the lever. A mechanical grinding sound vibrated through the airframe, the sound of landing gear deploying without hydraulic assistance, falling and locking through backup systems and mechanical linkages. 3 green lights appeared on the panel. Gear down and locked, Park said, exhaling with relief. All 3 green. Good, Maggie said. Now we're committed, no going back. Final approach checklist. 9,000 feet. The runway was ahead now, a gray strip that still looked too narrow, too short, impossible to hit with a crippled aircraft. Flaps, Maggie said. Give me 5 degrees, just 5. We can't risk more with the hydraulics we have left. Park extended the flaps incrementally. The aircraft shuddered but held together. Speed, Maggie asked. 210 knots, Rodriguez said. Way too fast. Perfect, Maggie said, and Rodriguez shot her a look that questioned her sanity. We need that speed. We have no thrust reversers, limited brakes. That runway is 10,000 feet long. We'll use every inch, but we'll make it. 6,000 feet, 5,000. The crosswind hit them like a fist, a gust from the left that pushed the aircraft sideways. Rodriguez fought it, overcorrected, and the plane lurched right. Easy, Maggie barked. Don't fight the wind, crab into it, let the aircraft drift. You'll straighten out just before touchdown. I've never landed like this. I have 17 times in experimental aircraft. This is textbook compared to landing an X-plane in a Mojave sandstorm. Maggie leaned forward, her hand on the back of Rodriguez's seat, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. Captain, you have the skills. You flew combat missions, logged thousands of hours. Your body knows this. Let it work. I'll be your eyes for what you can't see. 4,000 feet, 3,000. In the cabin behind them, passengers gripped armrests and each other. Some prayed. Some cried. Some stared straight ahead with the blank expression of people who had accepted their fate. They didn't know that in the cockpit, 3 people who hadn't known each other an hour ago were performing a ballet of precision flying that would either save them all or kill them all. 2,000 feet. Boise Tower crackled. United 447, you are cleared to land. Wind check, 275 at 20, gusting 26. Acknowledged, Park said. 1,000 feet. The runway rushed up at them. Maggie could see foam trucks racing alongside, emergency crews in position, people who would either be pulling bodies from wreckage or celebrating a miracle. Power back to 55%, Maggie said, her voice absolutely calm. Hold your glide slope, you're doing perfect. 500 feet. The aircraft was crabbed into the wind at a 15-degree angle, flying sideways, the runway off to their left instead of straight ahead. It looked catastrophically wrong. Maggie, Rodriguez's voice cracked. Hold it, she said. Hold it, wait for my command. 300 feet. Now rudder and throttle together. Kick right, power to 60%, quick burst. Rodriguez's hands moved in perfect coordination. The nose swung right. The runway centerline aligned. 200 feet. Power to 40%, flare, gentle back pressure. 100 feet. The ground rushed at them at 190 knots, 60 knots faster than a normal landing. The runway looked like a gray blur. 50 feet. Hold it, hold it. 20 feet. Now cut power, full back pressure, let her settle. Rodriguez pulled the throttle to idle and eased the yoke back. For one suspended moment, Flight 447 floated above the runway, defying gravity, held aloft by nothing but hope and physics, and the skill of 3 people who refused to let 157 souls die. Then the main gear touched down. The impact was violent, a bone-jarring slam that sent shockwaves through the aircraft. Passengers screamed. The nose gear hit hard and the entire plane bounced, lifted, hit again. Stay on it, Maggie shouted. Maximum brakes, don't let her drift. Rodriguez stood on the brakes. The anti-skid system, thank God it was mechanical, kept the wheels from locking. The aircraft decelerated, but too slowly. The runway was disappearing beneath them at terrifying speed. 8,000 feet of runway left, 7,000, 6,000. We're not going to stop, Park yelled. Yes, we are, Maggie said. Thrust reverse on engine 2, try it. We don't have hydraulics for thrust reverse. Try it anyway. Rodriguez pulled the thrust reverser lever. Nothing. Then, a grinding sound and partial deployment. Not full reverse, but something. The deceleration increased. 5,000 feet, 4,000. Come on, Rodriguez muttered. Come on, come on, come on. 3,000 feet. The aircraft was slowing, perceptibly now. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. 2,000 feet. 1,000 feet. At 500 feet from the end of the runway, United Flight 447 came to a complete stop. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit except for the sound of 3 people breathing hard, hearts pounding, alive against all odds. Then Rodriguez laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that transformed into something like joy. Park was crying, hands over her face. and Maggie sat back in the jump seat, her whole body shaking now that adrenaline was draining away, and smiled. United 447, the tower's voice crackled, thick with emotion. Welcome to Boise. Emergency crews are approaching. Are you able to evacuate? Rodriguez picked up the mic, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped it. Tower, United 447 is down. All souls safe. I repeat, all souls safe. Behind them, the cabin erupted in cheers, screams of relief, sobbing. People who had thought they were dead discovering they were alive. Rodriguez turned to look at Maggie, tears streaming down his face. You saved us. You saved everyone. What's your name? Who are you? Maggie unbuckled from the jump seat, her legs unsteady. Margaret Chen, she said quietly. I'm a high school physics teacher from Bellingham, Washington. No, Rodriguez said, shaking his head. That's not who you are. That's not all you are. Maggie met his eyes and smiled. A real smile, the first in 20 years that came from the deepest part of who she was. No, she agreed. I suppose it's not. Emergency vehicles surrounded Flight 447 within seconds of it stopping. Foam trucks, ambulances, fire engines. A coordinated chaos of flashing lights and urgent voices. Captain Rodriguez guided the evacuation as slides deployed with sharp pops, passengers stumbling down onto the tarmac, many collapsing to their knees and kissing the ground. Maggie descended the forward stairs slowly, her legs shaky now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Her back ached, the old injury from '98 reminding her she wasn't 25 anymore. A paramedic tried to guide her toward an ambulance, but she waved him off. I'm fine, check the passengers. There's a pregnant woman in row 24. She stood on the tarmac, watching passengers embrace each other, watching parents clutch their children, watching people who'd been strangers an hour ago bonded forever by shared survival. The November wind cut through her coffee-stained sweatshirt. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly exhausted. A Boise airport official rushed toward Rodriguez, clipboard in hand, already starting the incident documentation. Behind him, Maggie noticed something that made her stomach sink. A news crew. Channel 7 Eyewitness News, their camera already rolling, capturing the scene. Captain Rodriguez, the reporter, a young woman with perfect hair and a microphone, pushed forward. Can you tell us what happened up there? Rodriguez looked shell-shocked, still processing that he was alive. We lost an engine, complete system failures. We shouldn't have made it. But you did make it. How? Rodriguez turned, searching the crowd of passengers and crew, his eyes finding Maggie standing off to the side. Her, he said, pointing. That woman, she saved us. 20 heads turned. The camera swung toward Maggie. She took a step backward, shaking her head. Captain Rodriguez is the one who landed the plane. No, Rodriguez walked toward her, his voice carrying across the tarmac. You need to know who this woman is, what she did. We had multiple system failures. We were going down. I was out of options. He stopped in front of her, his eyes red-rimmed. She came into the cockpit and flew like I've never seen anyone fly. She knew things about that aircraft I didn't know. She talked us through procedures I didn't think were possible. The reporter was already next to them, microphone extended. Ma'am, what's your name? Margaret Chen. I'm just a passenger. She's a former Air Force test pilot. First Officer Sarah Park had joined them, her voice strong despite the tears still drying on her face. She flew experimental aircraft, 15 years at Edwards Air Force Base. She saved 157 lives today. The reporter's eyes widened. This wasn't just a survival story. This was a hero story. Ms. Chen, is this true? You're a test pilot. Was, Maggie corrected quietly. A long time ago. I'm a teacher now. But the damage was done. The story was out. Within an hour, Maggie's name was trending on Twitter. By the time the FAA arrived to begin their official investigation, reporters had found her LinkedIn profile, Margaret Chen, physics teacher, Bellingham High School. Someone discovered an old photograph from an Edwards Air Force Base newsletter from 1995. Captain Margaret Ice Chen standing in front of an X-31, flight suit, helmet under her arm, unsmiling, every inch the professional test pilot. The photo went viral. By evening, the story had exploded across every major news network. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, CBS, all running versions of the same incredible headline. Mystery woman saves doomed flight, turns out to be legendary test pilot. Reporters dug deeper, and what they found was extraordinary. Margaret Chen hadn't just been a test pilot. She'd been one of the elite, part of a class of only 12 pilots selected in 1983 for the Air Force's experimental aircraft program, and one of only 3 women. While most Americans in the 80s and 90s had been going about their lives, Maggie had been flying aircraft that existed only in classified files. Former colleagues started coming forward, their stories painting a picture of someone legendary in a world most people never knew existed. Retired Colonel Frank Morrison spoke to NBC. Maggie Chen was the best pilot I ever flew with, and I flew with a lot of pilots. She had this supernatural calm. We called her Ice because nothing rattled her. I watched her land an X-plane with no hydraulics, no computer control, essentially a glider traveling at 300 knots. She set it down so gently you'd think she had full systems. We all thought she'd be the first woman general in the test pilot program. Dr. Jennifer Wu, a former NASA engineer, told CNN, Maggie tested aircraft that pushed every boundary of physics and engineering. The prototypes we gave her regularly failed mid-flight. That was the point, find the breaking points. Most test pilots would refuse certain missions. Maggie never refused. She'd study the systems, understand the risks, then take whatever we had up and bring back data that changed how we designed aircraft. The stories kept coming. The emergency ejection over the Pacific in 1991, when her engine exploded at Mach 1.8. The night landing in zero visibility using only instruments and instinct. The time she prevented a catastrophic crash by manually controlling an aircraft with a stuck aileron using nothing but throttle and rudder. 17 successful test missions of experimental aircraft. 4 aircraft lost, but 0 pilot fatalities on her watch. By the next morning, Margaret Chen's face was on the cover of USA Today. The headline read, "The Teacher Who Was a Legend." Bellingham High School was besieged by reporters. Students were interviewed, all of them shocked. "Ms. Chen," said Jason Martinez, a senior in her AP Physics class, "she's like the nicest teacher. She brings homemade cookies to study sessions. She stays late to help anyone who's struggling. She wears cardigans with cats on them." He shook his head in disbelief. "She was a test pilot, flying experimental jets. That's insane. That's literally the coolest thing ever." Sarah Kim, the quiet junior who rarely spoke, told reporters, "Ms. Chen always made me feel like I could do anything. She'd tell me that physics was about understanding how the world works, and once you understand, nothing is impossible. I thought she was just being a nice teacher. I didn't know she actually lived that." The story resonated in ways no one predicted. It wasn't just about a dramatic rescue. It was about hidden excellence, about women whose achievements go unrecognized, about how heroes often look nothing like we expect. Social media exploded with messages. This woman flew experimental jets and then quietly taught high school for 20 years. That's the most badass thing I've ever heard. She saved 157 people and then tried to go back to being anonymous. Queen behavior. Every time someone says, "She doesn't look like a pilot," remember Margaret Chen. Aviation organizations reached out. The Air Force wanted to honor her. The Smithsonian wanted her flight suit for their collection. Hollywood agents called with movie offers. Netflix wanted to option her story. Maggie's phone rang constantly. Her email inbox filled with thousands of messages, from former colleagues, from women in aviation, from students she'd taught over the years, from parents of passengers on Flight 447 who wanted to thank her for giving them their children back. But Maggie herself had disappeared. After giving a brief statement to the FAA and local police, she'd quietly slipped away from the airport. She'd rented a car, paying cash, using her driver's license before anyone thought to flag her name, and driven to a modest hotel on the outskirts of Boise. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching herself on the news, and felt like she was looking at a stranger. That composed woman in the old flight suit photograph, standing in front of experimental aircraft, was that really her? The gray-haired teacher who brought cookies to study sessions, was that really her too? For 20 years she'd been Margaret Chen, physics teacher, invisible, safe, content. Now the world knew who she'd been, what she'd been capable of, what she'd given up. And Maggie had no idea what came next. Her phone buzzed. Another call from a reporter. She silenced it and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how you go back to being nobody after the world has decided you're somebody. Outside her window, news vans were beginning to circle, hunting for the reluctant hero who just wanted to go home. Maggie made it home to Bellingham 3 days later, taking back roads and avoiding airports where reporters might be waiting. When she finally turned onto Cedar Street and saw her modest craftsman house with its peeling blue paint and overgrown garden, she felt a surge of relief. Then she saw the news vans. 5 of them lined her quiet residential street. Reporters stood on her lawn, cameras pointed at her windows. Neighbors she'd known for 15 years peered out from behind curtains, their ordinary street transformed into a media circus. Maggie drove past her own house and kept going. She ended up at her friend Patricia's apartment across town, sneaking in through the back entrance like a fugitive. Patricia, who taught English at the high school, opened the door with sympathetic eyes and a bottle of wine already open. "You're famous," Patricia said, pulling her inside. "I'm horrified," Maggie replied. Over wine and Chinese takeout, they watched the news coverage. It had been 4 days since the landing, and the story refused to die. If anything, it was growing. A Women in Aviation group had started a scholarship in her name. The Air Force had issued a statement praising her service. 3 different publishers had offered 6-figure book deals. Hollywood was in a bidding war for her life rights. "They want to make a movie about me," Maggie said, staring at the TV in disbelief. "They're talking about which actress should play me. Someone suggested Jennifer Lawrence." Patricia laughed. "You could do worse." "I could do better by being left alone." But being left alone wasn't an option anymore. The story had touched something in the American consciousness, a reminder that heroes walk among us unrecognized, that women's achievements are often invisible until circumstances force them into the light, that quiet lives can contain extraordinary depths. The letters started arriving, thousands of them forwarded by the school, the airline, the FAA. Parents of passengers on Flight 447 sent photos of their children with notes. "Thank you for giving us more time with our daughter. Our son got to graduate because of you. You gave us our future back." Women wrote about inspiration. "I'm 63 and going back to school for my pilot's license because of you. I showed my daughter your picture and told her women can do anything. Thank you for proving that our value doesn't end at 50. Former students wrote with shock and pride. "Ms. Chen, you helped me pass physics, and now I learn you used to fly experimental jets. You're literally the coolest person I've ever met." The school board called an emergency meeting. Principal Richardson called Maggie personally, his voice awed. "Margaret, we need to talk about your return. The media attention, it's overwhelming. We have reporters camped outside the school. Students can't concentrate. Parents are calling." "I'll resign," Maggie said immediately. "What? No, that's not what I'm saying. We're proud of you. The students are inspired, but we need to manage this situation. Would you consider doing a press conference? One official statement, answer their questions, maybe it dies down after that." Maggie closed her eyes. The thought of standing in front of cameras, microphones, dozens of strangers asking about her past made her stomach churn. But the alternative was hiding forever, letting speculation grow, never getting her life back. "Okay," she said quietly. "One press conference, that's it." The press conference was held at Bellingham High School's auditorium, normally used for graduations and school plays. It was packed with reporters, cameras, lights, a spectacle that felt absurd in the place where she'd graded papers and explained Newton's laws for 2 decades. Maggie walked to the podium in slacks and a simple blue blouse, her hair pulled back, no makeup, refusing to perform for cameras. She looked exactly like what she was, a teacher, not a celebrity. The room fell silent. "My name is Margaret Chen," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm a physics teacher here at Bellingham High School. 20 years ago, I was a test pilot for the United States Air Force. 4 days ago, I was a passenger on United Flight 447 when it experienced catastrophic mechanical failure." She paused, choosing her words carefully. What happened in that cockpit wasn't heroic. It was applied knowledge and muscle memory. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Park are the real heroes. They landed that plane. I simply shared information from my previous training. Any pilot with my background would have done the same. A reporter raised her hand. "Ms. Chen, you were one of only 3 women in an elite test pilot program. Why did you keep this quiet for 20 years? Maggie considered the question. "Because it was my past, not my present. When I stopped flying, I didn't stop being useful. I found a new purpose, teaching young people to understand the world through science. That felt just as important, maybe more important than anything I did before." "Do you regret leaving test flying?" "No, I loved flying. But I also loved teaching. We're allowed to have multiple chapters in our lives. We're allowed to change and grow and become different versions of ourselves." Another hand. "What do you say to the women and girls who see you as an inspiration?" This question made Maggie pause. She thought of Sarah Kim, her quiet student, of all the letters from women who felt invisible, of the mothers on Flight 447 who'd been terrified they'd never see their children grow up. "I'd say that your value isn't determined by whether anyone notices you," she said softly. "For 20 years I was just a teacher. Nobody wrote articles about me. Nobody asked for my autograph. But I was still the same person who'd flown those planes, smart, capable, experienced. Recognition doesn't create worth. It just reveals what was already there." She gripped the podium. So many women live extraordinary lives in ordinary circumstances. The nurse who saves lives every shift, the engineer who designs bridges, the mother who raises children while managing a career, the grandmother who learns to code at 70. We don't need fame to matter. We already matter. The room was absolutely silent. "I'm grateful I could help on Flight 447, Maggie continued. "But I'm ready to go back to my quiet life now. I'm ready to teach physics and grade papers and help students understand projectile motion. That's who I am. That's who I choose to be." She stepped back from the podium. "Thank you, that's all I have to say." Questions erupted, shouted demands for more information, more details, more of her story. But Maggie walked off the stage and didn't look back. Later that week, she stood outside her classroom as students filtered in for first period. They looked at her differently now, not with disrespect or distance, but with curiosity and something like awe. Jason Martinez stopped at the door. "Ms. Chen, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you were flying those experimental planes, were you scared?" Maggie smiled. "Every single time, but fear doesn't mean you can't do something. It just means you have to do it anyway." He nodded slowly, processing this. "That's kind of what you teach us in physics, isn't it? Like, gravity is scary when you're on a cliff, but understanding how it works means you can predict it, work with it, even use it." Exactly, Maggie said, surprised and pleased. You've been paying attention. As class began, Maggie noticed something different. Her students were engaged, really engaged. They asked questions, not just about physics, but about problem solving, about staying calm under pressure, about how science applied to real-world crisis situations. Sarah Kim raised her hand for the first time all semester. Ms. Chen, you said you used differential thrust to control the plane. That's basically like applying unequal force to create rotational motion, right? Like a torque equation. Maggie felt something warm bloom in her chest. Yes, exactly yes. Who else sees how that connects to what we learned last week? Hands shot up across the room. The media attention would eventually fade. The movie offers would be politely declined. The news vans would find other stories. But something had shifted permanently. Maggie had been revealed not as a hero but as a complete person. Teacher and pilot, past and present, ordinary and extraordinary. And somehow, impossibly, that revelation had made her a better teacher. Because now her students understood. The woman explaining physics equations had lived those equations at Mach 2. The teacher who stayed late to help with homework had once made split-second decisions that determined whether experimental aircraft lived or died. Science wasn't abstract anymore. It was real, urgent, powerful. And Ms. Chen, quiet, cookie-baking, cardigan-wearing Ms. Chen, had proven that knowledge could save lives. 6 months later, on a warm May afternoon, Margaret Chen stood at the front of her physics classroom on the last day of the school year. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes floating in the air like tiny stars. Her students, seniors, most of them heading to college in the fall, sat with the restless energy of people about to be free. On her desk sat something that hadn't been there in January, a scale model of an X-31 experimental fighter jet, meticulously detailed, mounted on a wooden base with a small plaque. To Captain Margaret Ice Chen, with respect and gratitude, your former colleagues at Edwards AFB. It had arrived 3 months ago, forwarded through official channels, accompanied by letters from pilots and engineers she hadn't spoken to in 20 years. People who'd heard about Flight 447 and wanted her to know she hadn't been forgotten. That what she'd done, both then and now, mattered. She'd kept it on her desk ever since. So, Maggie said, closing her textbook with a satisfying thump, we've covered everything from kinematics to thermodynamics. You've learned equations, solved problems, struggled through concepts that seemed impossible at first. She paused, looking at each face. But before you leave, I want to tell you something more important than any formula. The students leaned forward. They'd learned over the past 6 months that when Ms. Chen got that particular tone in her voice, reflective, serious, something worth hearing was coming. In January, something happened that brought my past into my present in a very public way, Maggie continued. A lot of you have asked me about flying, about test piloting, about what it was like, and I've answered those questions. But today I want to tell you what I learned from all of it, the flying, the teaching, and especially what happened on Flight 447. She picked up the Model X-31, turning it in her hands. When I was your age, I wanted to fly more than anything. I worked harder than I'd ever worked, pushed myself beyond what I thought possible, and achieved something extraordinary. For 15 years, I flew aircraft that most people will never even know existed. I was good at it, really good. Sarah Kim, now confident enough to speak up regularly, asked, "So why did you stop?" "Because my body gave out before my spirit did," Maggie said honestly. "I had a crash, injuries that meant I'd never pass a flight physical again. At 35, my flying career was over." She set the model down gently. "I thought my life was over too." The classroom was absolutely silent. But it wasn't. I discovered that teaching, helping you understand how the world works, watching the moment when complex concepts suddenly click, that gave me the same feeling as breaking through clouds into clear sky. different but just as meaningful. She walked around her desk, leaning against it in that casual way she had when she was about to say something important. For 20 years, I was just your regular physics teacher. Nobody knew about my past. Nobody cared. And I was okay with that. I was happy. Because I'd learned something crucial. Your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition of it. You don't need applause to matter. You don't need fame to be extraordinary. Jason Martinez, who'd gone from a struggling C student to planning to major in aerospace engineering, raised his hand. But don't you think it's important that people knew? Like, that girls especially knew a woman did what you did. Maggie smiled. Yes and no. Yes, representation matters. Seeing someone like you achieve something makes you believe you can too. But also, I was just as valuable when nobody knew. The teenage girls I taught for 20 years, the students I stayed late to tutor, the young women I encouraged to pursue STEM careers even when I was just Ms. Chen with no exciting backstory, that work mattered just as much. She gestured to the model plane. This represents who I was, but you, she gestured to the classroom, you represent who I am. Both are real, both are important. I'm not the test pilot who became a teacher or the teacher who used to be a pilot. I'm both. I'm neither, I'm just me, complete and whole and exactly where I'm supposed to be. Emma Rodriguez spoke up, a quiet freshman who'd struggled with confidence all year. Ms. Chen, what if we don't know what we're supposed to be yet? Then you're exactly where you should be too, Maggie said gently. I thought I knew at your age. Turned out life had other plans, and those plans were better than anything I could have imagined. She returned to her desk, picked up her grade book, a tangible symbol of her current life. You're going to change. You're going to become different versions of yourselves. You'll have careers, maybe several. You'll discover talents you don't know you have. You'll survive things you think will break you. And through all of it, you'll still be you. The bell rang, but nobody moved. One more thing, Maggie said. Some of you know I've started volunteering with women in aviation, mentoring young women who want to fly. It's something I can do now that I couldn't before. Use both my experiences to help others. So here's what I learned on Flight 447 and what I hope you remember. Your past doesn't leave you. It waits quietly, becoming part of your foundation. And when you need it, when the moment demands everything you've ever learned, everything you've ever been, it's there. She smiled at them, these young people about to launch into their own uncertain futures. You're going to be amazing, not because someone recognizes it, but because you are. Go be extraordinary in whatever way calls to you. And remember that Ms. Chen, cookie baking, cardigan wearing, physics teaching Ms. Chen, believes in every single one of you. The students erupted into applause. Several were crying. Jason was the first to stand, followed by Sarah, then the whole class, giving their teacher a standing ovation she hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want but accepted with grace. As they filed out, many stopped to hug her, to thank her, to tell her she'd changed how they saw the world. When the classroom finally emptied, Maggie sat at her desk in the silence, looking at the X-31 model. She reached out and touched it gently, remembering the feel of a control stick in her hands, the roar of engines, the perfect clarity of flight. Then she picked up her red grading pen and began marking final exams. Her phone buzzed, a text from Captain Rodriguez, flying to Seattle next week. Dinner in Bellingham. I owe you about 1,000 meals. The crew wants to see you. She smiled and typed back, I'd like that. Another message appeared, this one from Patricia. Wine night. I'm bringing the good stuff. Perfect, Maggie replied. Through her window, she could see students streaming across the parking lot, free for summer, full of possibility. She'd see most of them again in the fall, those who were returning. The seniors would scatter across the country, carrying pieces of what she'd taught them into their futures. Some would become engineers. Some would become pilots. Some would become teachers. All of them would face moments when they needed to be brave, when they needed to trust their knowledge, when they needed to remember that they were capable of more than they imagined. And maybe in those moments they'd remember Miss Chen, not the legend, not the hero, just their teacher who'd shown them that ordinary people contain multitudes, that quiet lives can hold extraordinary truths, and that who you are is always enough, whether anyone's watching or not. Maggie stood, gathered her things, and locked her classroom door. She walked through the empty hallways of Bellingham High School, past lockers covered in graduation decorations, past trophy cases and bulletin boards and all the familiar landmarks of her daily life. In the parking lot, she paused beside her sensible Honda Civic, no flashy car for a teacher's salary, and looked up at the sky. A passenger jet drew a contrail across the blue, heading west toward the Pacific. She didn't ache for it anymore, didn't feel the pull of lost dreams. She'd flown her last flight on that November day, talking Captain Rodriguez through an impossible landing, saving 157 lives with knowledge she'd thought she'd never use again. It had been enough, more than enough. It had been perfect. Margaret Ice Chen, test pilot and teacher, legend and nobody, hero and human, smiled at the sky, got in her car and drove home. She knew exactly who she was. And that was everything. The end.